For several years, massive reports of missing cases and murders flooded the headlines and news columns in the cities near the Dead River in Maine. Remnants of the deceased locals were constantly found in the woods. Some of the missing victims were never found. It became a recurring nightmare for the locals, until it stopped for more than a decade. However, the harrowing fear brought by these incidents they thought was long gone finally returns. David stays up late to complete some layers of the joint animation project with his wife Amy. When he decides to take a break, sipping coffee outside, he sees a woman standing in the distance. The woman stares blankly at him for a second before walking away. David decides to go back inside, confused and almost astonished at the sight. He peeks into another room where Amy and their child, Melissa, rest for the night. He quietly greets the child before returning back to his home office. Meanwhile, a woman named Ellen has just returned home from a party and sees that the main door is unlocked. She immediately blames her babysitter, named Nancy. Despite being drunk, she makes her way into the house, calling out to Nancy. She notices that her baby is not in the living room, and neither is Nancy. There are traces of blood on the doorway, which she doesn't see as she enters the kitchen. She spots a smear of blood on the floor, and when she looks up, she sees a child dressed primitively holding a small knife. Nancy's mutilated body lies on the kitchen top. There are 2 more children with the young girl, and another who appears behind her, holding a plastic bag containing the remains. As she screams in terror, one of the children strikes her head. The next morning, the gruesome murder at Ellen's house is discovered by the police when Nancy's mother called in after her daughter failed to return home last night. George, a retired policeman, is jolted awake when a sudden knock on the door sounds. Outside are 2 police officers. One of them is Vic, a former colleague. They have come to ask for his expertise. He was an expert on this kind of crime during his time. Meanwhile, the same mysterious woman David saw the other night, who is clad in the same clothing as the children from Ellen's house, roams the forest. She grabs a stick and proceeds to hit multiple times. Despite struggling in pain, she continues to whip the stick all over her. It is unclear why she does it. When George and the other police officers arrive at the crime scene, Vic explains that Ellen's husband was taken into custody, but they cannot find a direct connection to him, since he seems so worried about their baby, whose body was not recovered on the scene. Nancy and Ellen's hearts were ripped from their chests, and their lives were taken apart. They begin to worry that the previous threat in their once peaceful community has returned. Near a coastline, the mysterious woman follows the feral children, who are carrying Ellen and Nancy's, including the body of the. She then strikes again before proceeding to follow them. After their visit to the crime scene, George explains their plan to catch the suspects. 11 years ago, Maine was plagued by a feral flesh-eating clan that was responsible for the missing and murder cases in their town. Back then, the authorities were unaware of their connection to the cases, but as time progressed they managed to connect them to the descendants of the missing lighthouse keeper of Catbird Island in the 1800s. Due to the growing population, fishing, and tourism, his offspring made it to the mainland, where they went on a murder spree. The authorities failed to capture them, prompting George to deduce that the clan has been moving from one place to another to avoid getting seen. Now that they know some information about the clan, George believes they can finally track them down by going through the caves along the shoreline. He adds that they found the clan in a cave back then, and he hopes that it's still the cave where they currently live. He then instructs Vic to gather every troop they have to begin the search. Meanwhile, David and Amy's friend Claire and her son Luke arrive at their house for a visit. Later, a conversation between Amy and Claire reveals that Claire's husband, Stephen, left her with a huge debt after taking out a $2 million loan. Claire's name was put as collateral, therefore, the IRS is after their properties. The police have also failed to get a hold of Stephen for the past 9 months, putting Claire under a lot of stress lately. Outside, Luke borrows David's binoculars and proceeds to examine the nearby forest area. David teaches him to properly use them, and then allows him to wander through the woods. Back inside, Amy receives a phone call. Turns out it's Stephen, who informs her that he is currently on his way to their house. Meanwhile, the police search the first cave, but the clan is nowhere to be found. There are no signs of them, putting the pressure on George's shoulders. Luke starts exploring the woods and uses binoculars to scan the area. He spots a treehouse nearby and starts climbing the ladder attached to the tree. He carefully walks on the wooden floor before using the binoculars to scout the shore. A sudden noise startles him, so he takes a step back and comes across small bone fragments on the floor. After picking them up, he decides to climb down the ladder when he suddenly hears a noise again, causing him to promptly make his way down. Back inside the house, David starts to panic when he learns that Stephen is on his way to their house. He then calls Vic to ask for assistance, but it's another police officer named Gloria who answers the phone. Strangely, Gloria explains that Vic is out with most of the sheriff's staff investigating a murder and tells him to fend off Stephen with a gun in the meantime. She also advises him to be alert if anybody else whom he doesn't personally know may or may not come to their house that night. David is utterly confused, explaining how he cannot see himself standing on their porch with a shotgun. Just then, Luke arrives with the skeletons. He throws them onto the table while commenting on how he thinks they are cool. Meanwhile, Stephen comes across a woman named Susan who hitchhikes going to Portland. He mentions going to Dead River, prompting the girl to comment that it is such a long drive from Connecticut. When he learns that the girl knows the place, He asks her to ride shotgun with him until he arrives at Dead River. He will then drive her to the airport and pay for her flight back to Portland with a $100 fee for the trouble. He then grabs a drink and offers her some. However, Susan starts to feel uneasy, not due to the fact that he's drinking while driving, but because he is starting to act really weird. She then requests he drop her along the way. But Stephen refuses, saying she has to accompany him to Dead River. When she continues to refuse from giving in to his demands, he orders her to get out of the car while it's moving. After her plea, he finally agrees, but he tells her to throw her pack out the window After she obliges, Stephen stops and lets her out before driving off. In a cave full of skeletal remains that serve as the home of the Cannibal clan, the mysterious woman from earlier, whom they refer to as the Second Stolen, approaches a child who's pricking a prisoner called the First Stolen. Her task is to expand their clan by using the First Stolen to impregnate herself. She then starts before engaging. Meanwhile, the leader of the clan, whom they call the Woman, tells the man their hunt was a failure. She believes they are cursed after they accidentally took. They are going to use a ritual to keep their powers. However, since she explains that the ghost is angry and trapped, therefore, they will need to take another to keep their powers. Meanwhile, the police decide to call it a night and go house to house instead to advise everyone to lock their doors and windows and keep their phone lines open in case of emergency. In the house, Claire tucks Luke to sleep before joining Amy and David in the living room. While Claire complains about Luke's unusual habit before bedtime, they suddenly hear a loud thud coming from outside. David opens the door, and the Second Stolen bursts into the house, screaming. Her body is covered in blood. Claire immediately tries to contact the police, and David tells Amy to prepare a hot pot of water. Luke steps out of his room asking what is happening, but Claire tells him to stay inside his room, which he abruptly obeys. Unbeknownst to them, the clan has already surrounded their house and cuts their telephone line. Claire informs David that she cannot contact the police, so he tells her to use his phone. All of a sudden, the Second Stolen latches onto David and bites a piece of his, all while Claire watches in terror. The woman and the man enter the house through the kitchen window and proceed to assault Amy. The children then follow inside one by one. While Amy is tied up, the Second Stolen starts slicing through David's. Claire, who is terror-stricken as she watches the gruesome scene, is spotted by the man. She runs off with the man in pursuit and grabs Melissa, before locking herself in another room with Luke just in time before the man catches them. In the living room, the children start harassing Amy, while the Second Stolen pulls out David's from his stomach. Claire then explains to Luke that there are people inside the house wanting to hurt them, and their only escape is through the window. As the man strikes the door with an axe, Luke jumps out first. Claire then takes Melissa and follows Luke before the man breaks the door open. Claire lands safely and Luke tells her he knows a place where they can hide. Meanwhile, David breathes his last as his memories flash before his eyes. The Second Stolen is feasting on his guts. The woman then prepares to finish off Amy when the man arrives, rushing from upstairs to inform her that the baby is gone. She rages in frustration and immediately orders them to chase after Melissa, not before rendering Amy unconscious. Stephen arrives just as the clan steps out of the house. When they spot him, they launch an attack, hitting and ripping through the roof of his car. Just before he gets his head decapitated, he manages to drive off. On his way, he comes across the police vehicle with Vic and George. Vic orders Stephen to stop and tells him to back down while George inspects the car. Still in a state of shock, Stephen explains that a group of people, a man, a woman, and children attacked him. When they ask him where he came from, he cannot even remember David and Amy's last names in his panic. Vic suggests he accompany them back to the house, but Stephen refuses. He explains that the group is armed with knives and hatchets, so George pulls out his gun and assures him that he will be all right. Before they continue, Stephen finally remembers David and Amy's last name, Halbard, and blurts it out. Vic immediately calls their colleague Gloria to ask for reinforcements at the Halbard's place. Gloria then informs him that David recently called about a restraining order involving Stephen. Before they can arrest Stephen, he suddenly dashes into the forest. Vic then informs Gloria of Stephen's direction before packing up to go to the Halbards. Meanwhile, Luke leads Claire to the treehouse he found earlier that day. After some time, they begin to hear the clan approaching their direction. Claire tells Luke to count them and see where they're going. When Luke sees Amy with them, he insists on helping her, but Claire explains that they can't, they are outnumbered, and there might be more somewhere. Once the coast is clear, Claire tells Luke to climb down to get to their car and maybe get some help. Claire then guides Luke back to the house, desperately running for their lives. However, the man blocks their way. Claire entrusts Melissa to Luke and tells him to run, while she tries to buy them some time to escape. In the ensuing struggle, the man hits her head and knocks her unconscious. He then removes her clothes and carries her away. On the shore, the woman and two other children come across Stephen, who's currently evading the police. The woman notices Stephen first and tells the children to stop him. The child then attacks him, causing him to slip over the sand as they run away. The police have arrived at the Halbards, where they find David's remains. They also notice the bassinet, indicating that there is another. Alerted by a sudden scream coming from outside the house, the police immediately rush to check. The search for the source of the scream proves futile, until they are attacked by the woman and the children. Turns out the scream was a trap to lure them out. The children then latch on Vic and George, stabbing them while the woman finishes off the other police officer. Vic manages to shoot the girl in the head before he eventually faces his demise at the hands of the woman. Meanwhile, Luke climbs the treehouse, carrying Melissa. The woman then checks if George is still breathing. Afterward, she gathers the guns and takes the body of before walking away. In the woods, Luke watches from the treehouse as the man carries his mother, Claire, who is desperately crying for help. He cannot act impulsively, or else his initial efforts to flee will be fruitless. He waits until the man is far enough away before placing Melissa carefully down on the floor and promising he will come back for her. In the cave, the second stolen and the rest of the children arrive with Amy. Amy moves her gaze across the cave and sees the children preparing their dinner. Not far from them is a baby, crying, and in the corner is the first stolen, who appears to have been suffering from psychological trauma. The second stolen then restrains her beside the first stolen. The woman returns to the beach to take Stephen, who desperately crawls along the shore for help. She instructs the boy to dispose of the body of she deals with Stephen. To his frustration, Stephen curses at her, prompting her to pull a knife on him. He immediately stops talking, and the woman calms down in response. She helps him up and guides him in the opposite direction from where she told the other child to go. In another part of the shore, Luke follows the man, who's dragging Claire with him. Near the Halbards, George quits playing possum and finds the deceased bodies of Vic and the other police officer. He grabs his gun, which thankfully was not taken by the woman. When he realizes that Vic managed to finish off one of them, he fires his gun multiple times to attract the attention of the responding police. He then covers the body of the police officer before heading toward the beach to hunt for the clan. Back to the cave, the man arrives with Claire. The others are preparing their dinner out of David's. Claire sees Amy and grabs a knife from one of the children to free Amy from the restraints. This angers the clan, especially the man, who starts to slam her head onto the wall of the cave. She kicks his groin in retaliation, causing the second stolen to knock her to the ground. Then they start ganging up on her. Meanwhile, as the boy carefully lays the sand, he notices George approaching. He immediately takes cover behind the bushes. Moments later, George comes across and continues his search when he fails to spot the boy hiding in front of him. The woman arrives in the cave with Stephen. She immediately looks for the baby, referring to Melissa, to which the man answers by shaking his head. When she realizes that the boy has not returned yet, who she calls Rabbit, she stops the second stolen from cooking and orders her to find Rabbit. The woman then hands over a gun to the second stolen before she goes. Just then, Claire regains consciousness and recognizes Stephen, who tells her to keep her mouth shut, in fear that the woman will show hostility. Amy also wakes up, and Stephen cannot help but feel the frustration. He is in a cave with eating people and his ex-wife, along with her best friend. What could have been worse? All of a sudden, the baby starts crying, and one of the girls hands it over to Amy, who initially refuses to nurse it. However, the baby sucks on her like a hungry animal as she helplessly begs for it to stop. The woman then turns her attention to Stephen and asks him about Amy's baby, Melissa. He honestly says he has no idea, but the evil ex-husband in him suggests that they torture Claire to get some answers from her. The woman then instructs the children to use some kind of makeshift metal dentures that will allow them to easily rip off her. They start to surround Claire, and the woman orders her to reveal everything, which she eventually does in fear. Earlier, before she got caught by the man, she told Luke they will return to the house to call for help, but when the man blocked their way, she had no choice but to let them escape. However, the clan cannot understand what she says, as they are using their own unique language to communicate. Stephen starts mocking her and tells her to try harder to explain. Claire refuses to listen and spits at the woman's face, prompting him as Stephen watches passively, and Amy in terror. The woman orders the others to bite off Claire's, force her into revealing Melissa's location. Despite her desperate plea, the woman continues to interrogate her while the others start to feast on her. Meanwhile, the second stolen spots George, and she opens fire. However, her effort to subdue him proves futile, and she ends up getting shot right in her heart. She eventually passes away while Rabbit watches from the bushes. George grabs the gun and proceeds with the search just as Rabbit leaves. Not long after, George comes across Luke, who's also hiding in the bush. Luke proceeds to tell him where the cave is, and explains why he is there. He is still in a state of shock, but he manages to put an effort to get a slight chance to save his mother and Amy. George plans to confront the clan alone, and instructs Luke to stay hidden no matter who comes along. And if ever the police arrive, he tells Luke to guide them where he went. George promises they will do their best to get everybody out safely, before making his way toward the cave. In the woods, Rabbit notices the approaching group of police officers. He looks around and spots the treehouse where Luke left Melissa. Rabbit rushes toward the treehouse as the police draw near. Back in the cave, the clan continues to Claire, and Amy is forced to take hostage to make them stop. She threatens to finish off if they come any closer. Stephen starts to curse her, believing that her actions will only make the situation worse. But no matter how he sides with the clan, all of them will still end their meal. The woman slowly approaches Amy, and Stephen uses the distraction to crawl out of the cave. However, the moment he peeks outside, George hits him with a gun, rendering him unconscious. George then enters the cave. Inside, Amy hurls and immediately snatches the gun from the woman while she's distracted. Amy proceeds to hold the woman at gunpoint, but she cannot bring herself to pull the trigger. The woman uses her vulnerability as a window for an attack. She hits Amy, causing her to accidentally shoot the man. Claire then attacks the woman, while the man grabs Amy. Amy tries to shoot again, but she already fired the last bullet. The woman breaks free from Claire's grasp and grabs an axe to cut off Amy's. As she swings the axe, George arrives and shoots the man, along with the woman and the boy. When the boy tries to get up, Amy grabs him and pushes his head into the thereby burning his flesh. His screams surround the cave as the girl stabs George in the chest. He shoots her head before he eventually falls to the ground. Amy continues torturing the boy until he eventually breathes his last. Claire crawls toward her and tells her it's over, encouraging her to leave the place. Claire guides Amy outside the cave, where they hear Luke calling out to them from a distance. Stephen also regains his consciousness and tries to crawl behind them. Inside the cave, the woman turns out to be alive, and she slowly tries to get up. She approaches the first stolen and takes him with her. She pays respect to her and then grabs the axe. After checking if George is still alive, she pulls the first stolen with her out of the cave. Outside, she comes upon Stephen, who's trying to sneakily escape, and proceeds to cut his head open. Like a feral animal, she starts devouring his, giving the first stolen the chance to snatch the knife from her waist. Acting only on his whim, he stabs the woman while letting out maniacal laughter. In a rage, the woman grabs his head and snaps his neck, causing an immediate passing. After pulling out the knife, she walks deeper into the forest to find the runaway. Elsewhere, the police manage to rescue Amy, Claire, and Luke, but they still need to look for Melissa. Luke explains he knows where they can find him, and insists he comes to guide them. Unbeknownst to him, Rabbit has made his way up the treehouse and found Melissa. When Luke spots the treehouse, he immediately climbs up the ladder, despite the police telling him to stop. As soon as he steps into the treehouse, Rabbit attacks him from behind. Luke fights back, but Rabbit, who is way stronger than him, initially takes the upper hand. Rabbit gets distracted by Melissa's cries, giving Luke the chance to grab the axe and swings it directly toward Rabbit's chest, who then falls off the treehouse. Luke then picks up Melissa and cradles her, assuring her safety. Back in the cave, amidst the deceased bodies, the woman's baby is revealed to be alive, so is the woman, who still roams in the woods. The terror brought by the eating clan did not end that night.